Without any further ado, I'd like to throw the chair of our session to Annette Axon. Annette is a community worker with Valid, running community development work up in the East Gippsland area, and along with Adrian Terranova and the Gippsland Disability Advocacy team have been partners with Sydney University in promoting inclusive emergency management pilot in that area. And so I'll hand over to Annette to run the rest of the show for us.
Thanks, David. I'd like to thank you for that. Also acknowledge the work of our peer action group out in East Gippsland and the guys in Sale Wellington too for their part in this project. I'd like to welcome Michelle Villeneuve, who I'll just say a little bit about Michelle, who leads the Inclusive Community Development Research Workstream at the Centre for Disability Research and Policy at the University of Sydney. Michelle leads research on disability inclusive disaster risk reduction in Australia and has over 20 years of experience working in regions of conflict and natural hazard disaster to develop community-led programs and services and rebuild opportunities for people with disability, including those with disability acquired by human conflict and natural disaster. Michelle was a lead investigator on Prepare New South Wales, which produced the Person-Centered Emergency Preparedness (PCEP) toolkit through co-design process with the emergency management, health and community services personnel. The project outputs were recognised through a Resilient Australia Award in 2018. Designed for use by disability and health services in collaboration with people with disability, the Person-Centered Emergency Preparedness Toolkit includes a range of resources to develop an emergency preparedness plan. Prepare New South Wales won the New South Wales Government 2018 Resilient Award for Australia for the co-designed PCEP toolkit. Michelle also led the development of local guidelines for emergency managers' disability inclusive disaster risk reduction in New South Wales for the Enabling Community Resilience through Collaboration Project 2015-16. The project was also recognised for a Resilient Australia Award in 2017. So great work being done already, and Michelle's been working with us out in Gippsland, East Gippsland area to do the PCEP project out there. So without further ado from my end, I'll hand over to Michelle.
Thank you so much, Annette, for that introduction, and really excited to be able to talk to this captive audience. I feel like I just want to ask you questions more than present information, so I'll make sure that I try to stay on task myself. And hopefully I'll be welcomed back in the future to have more interactive discussions with some of you in the network where we have some shared interests. What I'll try to do is just give you an overview of person-centered emergency preparedness in the context of peer leadership. And I love the title of your forum series, The Power of Peers Leading. And so what I won't be able to tell you the whole of the story, but I hope I'll take you on a little bit of a journey about what I think is really important about bringing these two concepts together: person-centered emergency preparedness and peer leadership. So I'll share my slides, and we'll hope that my computer doesn't crash while we try to do that. I was teaching on Monday, and my computer decided to act up as soon as I wanted to share slides, but it looks like we're okay now. Annette, can you just let me know that you can see what's on the screen? Okay, great. And Annette, if you don't mind, if I start to go on too long, don't hesitate to catch me up. And if anyone would like me to slow down or review anything, please also do let me know. On this first slide, I have a picture of two peer leaders who participated in the Queensland project on person-centered emergency preparedness and peer leadership. And in the picture, there's one woman wearing a green shirt, sitting in her wheelchair, holding a microphone to another woman who happens to have a visual impairment. And they're doing a mock interview together about how you start a planning conversation about a really difficult topic, which is preparing for disasters and preparing for emergencies. It was really powerful event because the woman Tara, wearing the green short shirt and being the interviewer, had done a lot of pre-thinking and pre-planning with our team before this event. and she had developed quite a detailed plan to share with other people. And as part of that pre-planning, she'd done a lot of thinking about how confronting it can be to start this conversation from scratch if you haven't really ever thought about it before. And so in the session where we're looking at this picture on the screen, Tara's message to everyone in the group was go gently when you're starting this conversation. Don't rush the process. And together, she sort of demonstrated with Bev, her interviewee, what it might be like, how you might start that conversation on a strong rather than an off-putting foot. On my next slide is a picture of one of our emergency personnel from Queensland having a conversation with a participant at a forum. And this particular participant uses a wheelchair, has a support animal, and was having a conversation about emergency preparedness with this emergency person. And her name is Emily, the emergency personnel. And what was really interesting about Emily is she had never had any direct interactions with people with disability before. So this event was very special because Emily came away with a much better, deeper understanding of what are the actual risks to people with disability in emergencies by having really intimate conversations with different people. And this is one example of the conversations that were had around those tables. Now, I just want to acknowledge before I get started, Annette gave us a good introduction to where the PCEP started in New South Wales, the Person-Centered Emergency Preparedness Toolkit. In Queensland, I would say was the flourishing of PCEP. And the reason it was a flourishing is because we partnered with the Queenslanders with Disability Network in a project that was funded by the Queensland government. And the QDN, and some of you guys are on the line today, I can't say enough positive things about how QDN operates. And so part of my story today is to share with you QDN's approach, what we have learned from QDN about their approach to peer leadership. And I just want to acknowledge that a lot of the work that we've progressed since the early days of developing a framework for thinking about person-centered emergency preparedness has really been co-produced, tested, and trialed by a large group of people with disability across Queensland. And I also want to extend that to Gippsland, Victoria. So Valid and Gippsland Disability Advocacy have jumped on board. And over the last year, we've been able to take those learnings from Queensland and apply them in Victoria. So what I'm hoping is at the end, I will open the door to our colleagues in Gippsland to talk a little bit about their experiences. So it's a bit of a journey and a conversation that we'll all share together today. So this is what I'm planning to talk about. I want to talk about what is PCEP. So people who haven't heard about it before will know, at least in general, what it is. And I'll give you some links where you can find out more and where you can watch videos or read about it or find some easy read materials on it, whichever you find more useful. So I'll share a web link later and you can learn lots more than I'll be able to tell today. I also want to talk about why we put PCEP and peer leadership together. So that's a big important part of this story. And I think to really understand the importance of putting them together, it's really important also to talk about what we learned from QDN and how QDN does their peer leadership program. And I think that should be relevant to the group who's online today, who have a shared interest in peer leadership. And I will be really interested to hear after your reactions to how you do peer leadership and what it means for you. So today's story, thanks to my partners at QDN, tells QDN's story of peer leadership. And then I'll just share very briefly what the impact was of putting PCEP and peer leadership together. And then what we'd like to do is just kind of open that discussion so we can think about how all those learnings are now being used in the Victoria part of the project. So very briefly, person-centered emergency preparedness is a tool and a way of thinking that helps people to match emergency planning to the supports they need to be safe, healthy, and well in a disaster. It's meant to be used long before a disaster happens, so that people can act using their PSEP plan to make really good decisions, to feel confident in the choices that they're making in an emergency when things are very uncertain and stressing us out and really hard to respond. The idea is that we've had this pre-planning process in place to make that process a little bit easier. So the PSEP has three components. The first component is one of the most important parts of the PSEP, and we spent a lot of time developing the capability wheel, we call it. The capability wheel is a framework of 8 elements, and these elements are all the things you need to think about to plan for an emergency in order to be safe. And the PSEP, or the capability wheel, has all the things that everybody needs to think about to prepare for emergencies. So what's your living situation and how close are you to that bushfire affected area? Do you live on the top floor of a building, and when the power goes out, how will you get downstairs? Or do you have a private vehicle or access to transportation if someone's telling you to evacuate? Those are the kinds of things that all of us need to think about. It also includes the kinds of things that people who have disabilities, or I like to call it function-based support needs, also additionally have to think about to plan to be safe in an emergency. And this is a really important part of the PSEP, because before we developed this tool, there was nothing that helped people with disability to think in very specific detail about what they need. And so it's one thing to be told, have a plan, and to have a generic list of what everyone should have in their stay kit or their go kit, or to think about. And it's another thing for that to be really tailored to the support needs of people who might use equipment or have different ways of communicating or require support people in an emergency. And that requires sometimes, and for some people, extra planning, and extra planning with the people that support them, and extra planning for some of the tools and equipment that are going to be really priority needs. So we wanted to make a capability wheel that encompassed all of those things, but also to break it down, because that's a lot of things. So the benefit of the capability wheel is that it breaks it down. So you can just look at one of those elements at a time, ideally, without getting too overwhelmed. And the other thing I'll say about the capability wheel and why we think it's really important is that it's supposed to start with how you manage every day. So it's really not about how are you going to manage tomorrow? There's a fire evacuation. What are you going to do in each of these areas? It's actually first and foremost about thinking, well, actually, how do I manage every day? Who helps me? What equipment do I use? How do I go about my day? Where do I spend my time? And what do I need to think about? And it starts from that basis of strength in order to then move forward with the toolkit. So I also wanted to point that out as a really important part of the PSEP. The second part of the PSEP is that its foundation is in these 3 principles. Now, these 3 principles are grounded in a lot of conceptual thinking from a research basis about both preparedness and also people's motivation and action when they prepare. And it's also founded on what we know and understand about human rights and disability, and what we know about what stops people with disability from being able to take preparedness steps. But simply put, the 3 principles are: emergency preparedness is a process. It's not a one-time event. So just because you might have a person-centered plan today doesn't mean you don't have to keep at that plan, revisiting it and rethinking what has changed for you or what has changed in your life or circumstances, and checking in with your plan and checking in with your support people about whether it's a good enough plan for the next disaster. So we really like to think that it's a process that happens over time, and you do not have to do this all in one go. It's too much to do in one go. The second principle is that people are experts in their lives, so planning must start with them. And that's the title of the toolkit itself: Person-Centered Emergency Preparedness. We know what our support needs are. We know what is going to make us capable. And we also know what our weak spots are and when and how we're going to need the supports we need. So we're the best judge of how we should go about that planning process. So planning starts with us. And then the third principle is that person-centered planning conversations build the capacity of multiple people to help us be more inclusive. One of the biggest problems is that our emergency personnel don't always know how they can best support people with disability in a disaster, how to help them learn about evacuation warnings, how to help them know that they should evacuate, what to do when people arrive at evacuation center. And we have lots and lots and lots of stories from the Black Summer bushfires and other hazard events where this has been a really big problem for emergency personnel, and ultimately a big impact for people with disability and their experience of safety and well-being. So the toolkit actually, in a crafty way, brings all of those stakeholders together. And it does that through the last part of the PSEP, which is the 4 steps. So the 4 steps are very simply, first, to identify your strengths and support needs in everyday life. And that was what I was talking about with the use of the capability wheel. The second step is to know your level of emergency preparedness and to learn about your disaster risks. Step 2, which is in green on the slide, is a really important step. We always co-teach this, and when we work with our colleagues, we say, never go about this alone. So find your emergency manager at council, find your CFA or your Queensland Fire and Emergency Service person. Find the people who know about emergency risks. Find the people who fight fires to teach you about emergency risk and fire risk. So we always work together with emergency personnel. And step 2 is one of the ways that we begin to bring the knowledge of emergency personnel together with the expertise of people making their own plans. And by bringing those 2 things together, our emergency personnel are learning how to personalize risk information to what people with disability need to know and use in their own preparedness planning process. Step 3 is the actual grunt work of the planning process. And in our toolkit, we've put lots of tips and strategies and ideas and quotes and strategies from other people who've gone before making their plans. And in step 3 of our workbook, we've also been clear to show the stories where the planning is not perfect, because the reality is nobody's plan is perfect. If we engage in a planning process, it gets better and better over time, but it's not a perfect plan. And so we wanted to make sure that people weren't overwhelmed with step 3 in making their own personal plan. But instead, they recognize, oh, yes, we want to be optimistic that we'll have a really good plan, but also realistic that our plan is as good as it can be today, and we can work harder over the next few months to strengthen our plan. Step 4 is a really part of the PSEP and the toolkit, and that involves communicating your plan with the people who are actually going to be there in an emergency. The other thing that's really important about step 4 is that that's usually where, between step 3 and 4, we begin to identify where there are unmet needs, or you might call it gaps in people's planning. So they might identify that the real risk to them is the power going out in their house, and maybe needing a generator to manage equipment that's going to help keep them safe. And for some people, that can be serious equipment, like equipment that keeps them alive, life support equipment. For other people, it can be equipment that keeps them comfortable, like to go to sleep on an alternating air mattress or to have a breathing machine at night. So step 4 is really important to think about the gaps and figure out how are we going to communicate those gaps back into the system, particularly to our emergency planners at the local council level who have responsibility for knowing our whole community, understanding where the weak spots are in the community, and using the strengths or assets from our community to make sure that everyone is safe. And the other thing I suppose I want to say about this process is it's not just about physical disability. We often use examples of physical devices because it's easy for us to explain, using examples of wheelchairs, for example, to explain what that is. But we've been learning a lot from people who have mental health or issues around anxiety, and some of the ways that they've been using the person-centered emergency preparedness toolkit to help them actually think about, how do I manage my anxiety every day? How am I going to plan for how I'm going to manage that in an emergency event? And who needs to know about this to really help me communicate more effectively before, during, and after a disaster? So I do want to point out that we think that the toolkit is working quite effectively for a wide range of people. Now, on this next slide, I have the question at the top: why did we put PSEP and peer leadership together? And this is a really interesting part of the story, because we had been working with our colleagues in New South Wales, and then with our colleagues in Queensland, and particularly a group of peer leaders from Queensland who are identified quite often as people with disability, who are advocates or leaders in their community, and who are working towards some change toward inclusion in the broad in Queensland. And we had this PSEP tool, and we thought, well, this tool is really good, and we've been able to show how it can help people to make a plan. And we've been able to show how it can bring people with disability together with the emergency personnel to really help people understand what keeps people safe in an emergency. But what we really needed was, we needed everyone to know about the PSEP to be able to access and use that PSEP. So we thought about the peer leadership program in Queensland. And QDN has a network, as you can see by the map, with a number of red pins that are meant to indicate about 25 peer leaders that we've been working together with over the last few years with QDN. And in the center, there's a picture of a group of people at one of our earliest workshops. Some people with disabilities, some of them are support workers, and they're all together talking about preparedness planning. And we thought, well, if we actually use the power of QDN's peer leaders and we teach them about PSEP, then it means that they should be able to reach a wide number of people with disability in their local communities who might not otherwise learn about or know about or access this toolkit. And the other reason we did it was because we wanted to make sure we were connecting local people with local emergency personnel. And so if we did that through the peer leadership groups, it would mean that we would be introducing people in their own local communities to the people they need to learn from about making a plan, and who might actually be the people who will support them in an emergency event. So I wanted to turn our attention to thinking about the importance of first then understanding, well, how does QDN's peer leadership program work? And is our idea of putting PSEP and peer leadership together going to be a really effective idea? And if so, what is it about the peer leadership program that's actually really helpful in the first instance? So one of the first and early things we did was we spent a lot of time talking with the QDN's peer leaders and the staff that support the peer leadership program in order to understand how it works. So I just wanted to share what I think are some really important lessons from QDN and their leadership approach. So we asked that, well, I guess I should say we interviewed, out of those about 25 people, we interviewed 14 peer leaders in depth. And there was quite a range of peer leaders who were involved in those interviews. So people who identify as women, men, and non-binary. And there was a total of 14 of them that spread from the south of Queensland all the way to the far north of Queensland. So we got a good view of different perspectives of different peer leaders. And some of these peer leaders had been new as peer leaders, only just starting as peer leaders in recent months or weeks, and others who'd been for years working as peer leaders with QDN. So quite a range of experiences. We interviewed these 14 people in great depth, and we asked them, what's the main purpose of the group? Overwhelmingly, the main reason that these peer groups come together is to share information. But I thought it was really important to also highlight what kind of information gets shared and what do they value about the information. And what they valued was high quality information, and that information that was informed by expertise, and that was often through invited guests who have some knowledge that they brought in to speak to the peer group, but also information that was informed by the lived experience of people with disability. So it always seems to be that when they're sharing information, it's a combination of expert information alongside lived experience of people with disability who have knowledge and experience. Was how they shared information and what they valued about that. And what we heard over and over again was the importance of having uplifting, interesting, and relevant information that was broken down and tailored to the needs of people in their support group. And all of these support groups, I should point out, almost all of them had such a range of different types of people with different education levels and different types of disabilities and different life experiences. So it's really interesting to think about such a diverse group of people coming together, all coming together to learn about the same kind of information, but all wanting it sort of tailored and individualized. So they're wondering, well, what can I do with that information and how can I use that? And it was interesting to hear how important it was to both present it in an uplifting way and for it to be able to be broken down and tailored. Now, the other thing we learned was what actually is going on inside those peer support groups. And this is, if you read a paper, or if you read some of the early research around the development of some of the peer support groups when the NDIS was going in, you can get a general picture of what happens in peer support groups. But if you spend a lot of time with the peer leaders, you get a better sense of what does that actually look like? Almost like, what does it feel like? What does it taste like? What does it smell like to be inside those peer groups? And so this slide just has some words on it. And in the center is probably, I think, the most important. It feels like inclusion and belonging. And the reason seems to be because the peer support group fosters this sense of community. One of the quotes that stands out for me when thinking about fostering community was what the peer leaders said about being seen. Some of these peer groups intentionally chose very public places to hold their peer support groups, the local RSL, a library, and so on. And that was because they valued being seen and heard in their community, and that they really valued diversity as a strength and fostered a sense of community around that. On the top right side of the diagram, I have safety and respect. And that permeated all information we heard from peer leaders. This is a safe place where I can say what I want. I'll be respected even if people don't agree with my opinion. This is an opportunity for me to express myself. And lots of people said it's a place where I can say things about my disability without feeling judged by other people. In the middle, I have serving the group and providing opportunity on each side of inclusion and belonging. And serving the group is really interesting because that's really a lot of what the peer leaders were doing by taking on the role of peer leader. They were being non-judgmental and they were acting in a listening role. And I'll tell you a bit more about that in the coming slides. On the opportunity side, it was really not just about being seen now, but being heard. So what we heard about providing opportunity was that it gave an opportunity for each member of the group to be heard. What are my issues? What are my challenges? How do I understand this information? What do I want to get from this group? And that, I think, really speaks to some of that, that idea around tailoring the information to each individual, even though we're a diverse support group. And on the bottom, I have two other words. On one side, it says spirit, and on the other side, it says empowering confidence and autonomy. And I think these things go a little bit together too. But under spirit, the quote that resonates most for me is, we belong to this group. We're not just attending this group. And there was a real spirit of a sense of crafting that feeling of belonging for everyone. And on the other side, this empowering confidence and autonomy, the thing that stands out for me here is that these groups are a way of shared learning, sharing our experiences, sharing knowledge of experts that we bring to the group, but there is no pressure. You do not have to use what you've learned. You can use a part of what you've learned. You could use all of what you learned, but it's your choice and it's up to you on how you're going to use this information. So there's a real sense of empowering the confidence to make those choices, to use that information in a way that makes sense, and also to use it in a sort of a time frame that makes sense and feels right for each individual. So that was just a little snapshot of what happens in the group. We also learned, how does the group make people feel? And I've got some words on the slide that I think speak for themselves, so I'll just read them out. The group made people feel safe, respected, heard, equal, empowered, confident, supported, and cared for. And I think some of this was really important when speaking with the peer leaders, because one of the things that I think is easy to overlook in a report or a paper about peer leadership is the fact that these peer leaders do something really quite lovely, and that is they invite people in, and they make sure that people who aren't usually at the table are welcomed in to this particular table in their community. So what helps these things to happen, for people to feel this way and for the group to function in this way? It doesn't happen automatically. There's a lot of effort and things that are going on behind the scenes. And that's what I would like to spend a bit more time talking about. One thing that's really important to consider is that the peer leaders said the meeting is structured, but it's also flexible and relaxed. So there's this sense of, we need some structure to the group, but we also don't need the pressure. Thank you very much. It needs to be inviting and a relaxed atmosphere. So some of the structure comes from check-ins and check-outs, activities that help people feel connected together as part of the group, and an opportunity to reflect on what they've just done together for their 1 or 2 hours of time spent together as they go off back to their own homes and communities. Another thing that structures it is having a topic, having a guest speaker, pre-planning questions, and usually the peer leader takes quite a large role in working on pre-planning that. Also structuring an opportunity for people in attendance to ask questions about the topic, to share information. And they were also very clear that it wasn't just about the guest speaker giving answers to those questions. It was about members of the group sharing their lived experience and having real dialogue among each other about those questions. So I think that's where some of the flexible nature of the group comes in. So it moves from a structured talk to a real interactive discussion, and the lived experience starts to take a real presence in the group. And then, of course, some of the flexible and relaxed parts come from the general social interaction between peers. And lots of people described the group lingering and lasting longer than it's even scheduled for, because people are enjoying the social catch-ups and the interaction. Another thing that's really important about helping it to happen is the facilitation support. And there are two main types of facilitation support. So one comes from the disability organization itself. And in this case, we're talking about QDN. And I think it's really important not to underestimate the effort that QDN puts in to supporting their peer leaders to support the group. And I'd like to talk a bit more about that today as well. And the other kinds of facilitation support that we learned are really important is that the peer leader having a co-leader, or in QDN's case, a co-convener, is really important, because it's a big job to manage a peer support group and to sustain that over time. So having two people who can support the facilitation of the group can be a really, really helpful tool. And the third thing we learned from peer leaders about what helps it to happen is that there's practical and instrumental support that people find very meaningful. Food brings people out. For called groups, having interpreters scheduled and paid for by the disability organization. Transportation for people who might not otherwise be able to get to the group, being supported, planned, and paid for through the disability organization. So you can see in some of these examples the importance of resources, and probably on many of your minds are, well, how do we actually get and sustain the resources to do those types of things? And I think that's an important question for us to keep in mind. We also thought about what is hard about being a peer leader. And frankly, we expected a long laundry list from the peer leaders about what they thought was hard, but these were the three things that they felt were the things that they struggled with the most. Keeping such a diverse group of people on track and on topic and centered around their plan for the day. They also found it takes a lot of their own personal time. their own personal energy, and they're quite willing to do it, of course. And I'll talk a little bit more about why they seem quite willing to do that, but also want to recognize that it's a lot of energy, a lot of time, and a lot of commitment, a lot of personal phone calls, extra going for coffee for people, extra relational effort that they make to make sure each and every individual of the group feels welcomed, is reminded, shows up, has what they need to arrive by way of transportation, and so on. And that's a lot of emotional, but as well as practical and organizing energy. And then they also found that it's tricky to sustain the group over time. And with any group, you can come and go with purpose, and members might come and go. So sustaining that group to keep everyone interested and motivated over time is an ongoing challenge for the peer leaders. So how did the peer leaders describe their role? We organized it into two lists: things that being in certain ways, and doing certain things. So being, they described as being fair dinkum, being knowledgeable, being unbiased, being reliable, being giving of their time, of their energy, of that spirit we talked about, being consistent, and being inclusive. On the doing side, there was a lot of real skill based to what the peer leaders are doing behind the scenes, researching to find that guest speaker, to learn more about the topic themselves so they can prepare some questions for a Q&A period, and so on. Inviting people, which might mean going for an extra coffee to make someone who's reticent to show up to the peer group feel welcomed and want to come along. Connecting people with each other, but also connecting them to services and supports and phone numbers and other people outside the group and in the community. Listening, organizing, managing people, managing time, managing schedules, and tailoring that information to support people to find it meaningful for themselves on an individual level. So we actually thought and worked with QDN about this idea. We actually felt that this was transformational leadership at its finest. And normally you would take a theory and develop a peer group around it, but this peer group has emerged over a number of years and over a way and a style of QDN supporting it. And I think they've crafted and created a really unique way of doing transformational leadership. And it's a style in which leaders encourage and inspire and motivate others to create the change that will help grow and shape future outcomes. And there's sort of four things that underlie this idea of transformational leadership that I see in all of those things we've talked about so far. That the peer leader is acting as a role model. So in our case of person-centered emergency preparedness, that means they make their own plan before they encourage other people to make a plan themselves. They hold high expectations and inspire optimism. So they expect that people with disability can make a person-centered emergency preparedness plan and inspire optimism that's realistic, even in the face of challenges and barriers to making those preparedness plans. Having a really acute understanding of other people's needs. So a real sense of not just what's in it for me, but what does everyone need to get out of this, and what are the unique needs of individuals. So that goes back to this common theme of tailoring it to the individual, even though we're in this diverse group coming together. And then the fourth one is questioning and thinking in new ways about a problem. And I think from our peer leaders' perspectives and their reflections on it, they all talked quite a lot about the things that they learned and the ways that they were growing and changing as a result of being in this peer leadership role. So what helps transformational leadership, and what has helped QDN's peer leaders to be transformational leaders? There seems to be these four things that are really critical ingredients. One, that there's a purpose and a meaning to what they're doing. So the peer leaders all talked about owning up and showing up for QDN's larger vision and mission. So being part of QDN, being part of the objectives of QDN as an advocacy organization, being part of a group that's going to support their local community to reach broader goals and aims. So when the QDN began this group, it was at a local level, making sure that people who should be on the NDIS knew about and were on the NDIS. But at a broader level, the peer leaders were working toward QDN's vision to say, who's getting missed out? What do we need to lobby government about? What do you need to know about people in my community who aren't able to access services and supports at the local level? And that was really powerful for the peer leaders to feel like they're part of something bigger. But in order to do that, it meant that they needed mentorship and coaching. Like all of us, we're not all born educators. And so it does require some capacity development, some mentoring and coaching. And that helps to overcome some of those really hard things, like keeping groups on track and some facilitation techniques. And how do you manage being a leader of a peer group and being unbiased and maintaining a sense of support when you're helping someone that you might not have tons in common with, but you're actually there to support them within the context of that group. And then the other thing was connection and support. So the peer leaders supported groups in their own community, but they also had a network among themselves and a connection and a peer support network of leaders. Where that mentoring and that coaching and that capacity development took place, and where the relational aspects of their enthusiasm, I suppose, and connection to each other is developed. And the other really practical thing the peer leaders told us was having co-conveners is a really great strategy. So a co-leader from the group who can really help you with the day-to-day grunt work of managing that group and take some of that pressure off of you and being able to do that together. But that means your co-convener needs to be a cooperative partner in that process. So really choosing the right co-conveners to work together becomes really important. And related to that is having a succession plan. Our peer leaders know that they may not always be able to sustain over a really long period of time being the leader. So there's something important about passing the baton to the next person and creating that capacity and providing opportunity for others to become leaders. So if we look at it all together and that bigger picture, I think this is one of the things that's been really successful about how QDN has operated their peer leadership program. In the middle, we see that what's actually happening in the peer groups that I talked about before that really is centered around inclusion and belonging, but it's grounded in those transformational leadership facilitators of purpose and meaning and mentorship and coaching, connection and support, and succession planning with support from co-conveners. And QDN has really worked hard in the last little while too to have an emerging leaders program to have a succession planning process in place as well. So what was the impact when we combined PCEP with this wonderful process of peer leadership? We adopted that transformational leadership idea, and we had goals and aspirations ourselves for the peer leaders, high expectations, and we role modeled the person-centered emergency preparedness process and then expected them to also role model that and enable it in others. And on the screen, you can just see a brief overview of some of the things that happened over the last 18 months in Queensland. 25 peer leaders with disability were trained in PCEP. 22 people with disability received individual mentoring in PCEP. 47 people with disability made individualized person-centered plans that were communicated with their support network. 281 people with disability were introduced to PCEP through peer support groups and networks. And 2,857 people learned from, with, and about person-centered emergency preparedness in partnership with people with disability, co-leading sessions and forums and events, a little bit like today's event about emergency preparedness. So I promised you that I would leave you with a website where you can go to learn more, because I've only touched the surface of what PCEP is and the work we do around emergency preparedness and emergencies. But I know our colleagues from Gippsland will talk next about what they've been doing and the disaster context and the impetus for bringing person-centered emergency preparedness into Victoria and rolling with that program there. But if you do want to follow up with any resources or to get in contact, you can follow that website. It's www.collaborating inclusion.org. And you just have to touch on any of the projects and enjoy the videos and the information that you'll see there. And if anyone wants to get in touch, I've just left my information on this last slide. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that, Michelle. I'm sure we would all agree that it's been a great presentation. We're going to hear next from a group of people who are working on the project here in Eastern Victoria. After they're finished, there'll be time for people to ask questions of the panel or Michelle. All right. One of the things that I've learned through this project and having lived through the summer bushfires in Mallacoota is that you don't know what you don't know. Having going through evacuations and having going through loss of house and trying to figure that out when we thought we were prepared, what I realised that, you know, you don't know what you don't know, and we weren't as prepared as what we could. So this project, personally, makes a lot of sense and is so super important if you live in places where natural disasters are imminent. Saying that though, there are places such as Sale that went through the floods not that long ago, which wasn't expected. Again, the importance of being prepared. So we have a panel of 3 people coming up who are working on the project in collaboration with Victorian Disability Advocacy and Ballard to hear their stories. And we have 3 people. There's Maureen Webb, Cameron Sir, and Adrian Terranova. And one at a time, I'm going to introduce them and ask questions of them. They can tell their stories, and then we'll go to questions from the group of people here. So Maureen, we'll go with you first. Where are you, Maureen?
I'm Maureen Webb, live in Omeo, and use a wheelchair and have used a wheelchair for nearly 30 years, and have been through a couple of in Omeo region. So the first one's probably where you get some experience and get evacuated, and then so the next time you think you know precisely what you need to have to be prepared. And I'm fairly involved in my local community in different groups on committees. I quite like doing bookwork, so I'm treasurer of a few different things. And in preparing for the 1920 bushfires, a group of us had gone to the CFA to learn what we needed to do to help man the CFA shed, or while the fire people are out doing their firefighting, they need somebody in the thing taking information from the various different things, different tankers and groups. So I'd done that, and then as fire was quite present in the area, the Shire organised group of volunteers to go and man a relief centre, but it changes the name of what they have because we're such a small community. We don't have an official relief centre. The closest one is Bansdale, which is about 126 k's from where I live. So they had set up a relief centre at the rec reserve, but the actual place that deemed the place of refuge is the Oval, because the rec reserve isn't ember proof and a whole lot of other things. So we had groups of us just doing a session. We do something like at the relief centre, just for people who wanted to come in and get information, to have someone to sit and talk to, or just get information about where the fire is, what the expectations were. And so that went on for a couple of days. And then when the fire became more prevalent and looked like it was going to come into the town, the Shire workers left because they needed to protect their own place of residence, and they were going to close down the relief centre. So I took it upon myself to go and man it, because there are quite a lot of older people in this community, and they just needed to not be at home by themselves. And we'd had public meetings with CFA and DELP and things like that, and the local captain had assured the local people that they could bring their dogs and cats with them because they didn't want them staying at home rather than not being able to bring their pet. And they were just concerned that some of the people who live by themselves, who their pet part of their family, wouldn't leave if they didn't have that facility. So, yeah, then I organised groups of people, and so we just ran a roster, and we had quite a few people for probably 3 or 4 days. And then Sarsfield had burnt by that stage, so the Shire worker came up and he took over the running of the facility. Now, after all that went through, the fires didn't burn the town, but burnt quite close around. I live on a farm, and we had 75% of the paddock burnt and probably 9 kilometres of fencing burnt. So, yeah, there's quite an impact for everybody. And then you sort of get over the fire and move on. But some of the stuff about bushfire recovery isn't that easy, and you end up giving a lot of time in the planning. And I hear on the radio this morning that not a lot of money is actually going to come into our communities, even though there was a lot that was promised. So, yeah, it's just quite difficult to plan because each experience is quite different. But I've been involved with Michelle and the PSEP planning, so I have found that really quite good for just thinking a bit more outside the box, working out what support networks there are, maybe not in Omeo, but in the next closest town, and making sure that we've all discussed how we deal with the next one, whatever it is. Yeah, there aren't a lot of people. I mean, Omeo only has a population of 350, so there aren't a lot of people with a disability in the area, but there are a large portion of the population is older and often is living by themselves. So it's that stuff of making sure we've got a listing of all of the people and what their particular needs are, making sure we encourage people to plan a bit further in advance than just dealing with each issue as it arises. We had in our refuge centre, we had 30 huskies, we had a couple of horses, we had a turtle, we had birds. So it's sort of surprising what people bring, and how we all had to be a little bit cooperative to work together to make allowances for everybody's needs and likes and dislikes. But yeah, it's just one of those. I think that the manslaughter laws have made things a little bit different in as much as an employer can't ask their employee to work on a code red day. So the community has to be a little bit more prepared to be able to deal with these disasters as a community, rather than relying on paid staff to be looking after you. So that's about my story.
Wonderful. I think Omeo is very lucky to have you there, and knowing that you facilitated that relief centre yourself and did all the hard yards there. So well done. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cameron Sir. Cameron's the peer action group leader in Bansdale who works for Ballard and is part of the project. I've got a couple of questions for Cameron to talk about. So tell me, Cameron, what was being part of the PSEP project mean for you?
Being a part of the PSEP team has taught me not only how to work professionally as a team, but also present and help others at a professional level with their emergency kits, and most importantly, how to be a leader. It has taught me what is included in the kits and how they work. Now I have made up my own emergency kit and I have it on standby in case of future emergency/disaster situations.
So tell me, having a plan, has it made you more aware of what you need to do and be ready for?
It sure has. Instead of running around the house at the last minute with a last minute emergency kit, having the plan has made me more organized and has made future emergency situations less stressful. And most importantly, it has made me able to live a more independent life by myself.
So then tell me then, the people who are in your life and who support you, has it given them more confidence about you living by yourself in community by having this plan and being prepared?
Yes, it has. Seeing that my parents are moving away soon, it has made them more relaxed knowing that I have this kit in place for when an emergency arises. It has made my carers more aware of what my needs are and what assistance is required to support me.
So overall then, the whole experience has been part of the program and the project, which is not finished yet. We're still 3/4 of the way through. How has that been for you?
Well, it's a real eye-opener. When people think of an emergency kit, they think, oh, I'll grab it at the last minute, put a couple of clothes in a suitcase and run out the house. But really, there is a lot more depth in an emergency kit. There is a lot more things to think of. There's a lot more just inclusion with these kits rather than last minute decisions.
Well done. Thank you. Anything else you'd like to add?
No, not that I know of.
Job. Thank you very much. Well, next person we're going to chat to is Adrian Terranova, and Adrian's the CEO of Gippsland Disability Advocacy. Adrian, tell us about the experience you've gone through with work that's been going on with the PSEP in the area.
Yeah, thanks, Annette. Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Adrian. Lovely to be here. I'd just like to acknowledge I'm meeting on Gunno-Kurno land. I'm in Traralgon at our head office, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I probably might just, if I can, Annette, just talk a little bit for a quick moment about some history, and then we'll talk about PSEP. So our organisation, we're a regional disability advocacy organisation. We're the only funded organisation that covers Gippsland. We're funded predominantly through the National Disability Advocacy Program, but also get a small amount of funding through the Office for Disability. Paul and David, you'll be disappointed if I don't jump in now and say that we're grossly inadequately funded, and we're constantly looking to ensure that our work is properly funded, really. Anyway, we'll keep moving on that. Our organisation, we have a mission, and that's to advocate, promote and be responsive to the welfare rights and interests of people with disabilities and to build a more inclusive community. And our vision is that through advocacy, people with disabilities are empowered to exercise their rights. So if you think about our mission really being about advocacy and building more inclusive communities, and our vision being empowering, we just felt if we're really true to our mission and vision, when the bushfires and when the natural disasters are occurring, and let me tell you, we have enough of them in Gippsland, that we are there and supporting our community in whatever way possible. It is very difficult when we're not funded very well, but what ends up happening is we mobilise all our staff, and we generally go above and beyond. We first started doing emergency work or bushfire recovery work in the Bunyip and Yannar fires. That was in March of 2019. It was an unseasonably warm day. It was the weekend of March to 4th, and we had nearly 40-degree days. And those regions in Bunyip and Yannar, which predominantly forest, but there's a lot of houses in there, had bushfires, and they come on really, really quickly. So our organisation, they opened relief centres up in Traralgon. That was in Morwell and in Bunyip, but then they kept moving to Bunyip, one to Warragul, depending on where the fire was. So we just really felt that our work was really important at that moment, to be there, to be part of and ensuring, if we know that in Gippsland we're above the national average, 1 in 4 people in Gippsland has a designated disability. We just knew that if there was all these people impacted by bushfires, how many of them would have a disability, or how many of them would be carers of people with disabilities. So we found it really important to be at the relief centres at those March 19 bushfires. Fast forward to December, January, which was like something we hadn't seen before, but we again did a lot of work at the relief centres. But prior to relief centres, we were trying to go to as many of the local, particularly Denise Lamble, our East Gippsland advocate, and myself, we're trying to go to as many of the local community meetings that we're on. And what we noticed at a lot of the community meetings, because they were generally put on really quickly, literally there would be a message out saying there's a 4 o'clock meeting in Bensdale tonight or wherever. We found that some of the venues where they weren't all that friendly for people with a disability, and separate to that, we also encountered a number of barriers where some of the language really wasn't of an easy English, and so we were there just basically observing and taking notes and engaging back with our community. We had a number of clients impacted that we were constantly talking to about, hey, there's a meeting tonight. This is the key message. So really trying to mobilise our community wherever possible. We also, the Bensdale, and I'm really happy that Maureen's here and just so pleased that she identified the work that she did, because I was thinking that she may not, and I sent an email saying, make sure that we talk about Maureen's work, but Maureen did it. So thank you, Maureen. We found in East Gippsland, there was relief centres opening up all over the place, but then Bensdale really become overflowed. And we talk about animals that Maureen was talking, like there was just all sorts of things happening at the Bensdale Recreation or the sporting centre in Bensdale, the football ground. It got so big that they actually opened up relief centres down the highway heading towards Melbourne. So 45 minutes down the road from Bensdale, they opened up one in Sale, and 45 minutes from Sale is Morwell, and another relief centre was opened up there. So there was just lots happening. But we've just been really pleased to be in this space. We want to be part of this space because what was really, really evident at the time of the bushfires was, in many instances, people with a disability felt that I'll be okay because I have a disability, and people know I have a disability and I'll be looked after. We know that in literally what happens in such a quick time, that may not be the case. In some instances, it was wonderful, and we know people who were really well supported, but sometimes it's just not possible. So the PCEP just allows us to have a platform in this space. It probably marries up our work previously in being at the relief centres. I will say that at the time of the bushfires, I was having many conversations with our funding bodies about these situations we're encountering, because we were coming out with 15 to 20 people each and every day over a number of days. And when we're funded to work with 160 annually, and we did 40 in 5 or 6 days, you can just start to see the pressures and barriers. So it was good. It was difficult work, but it was really good for our organisation to be part of it. And we're probably starting to highlight to government now that there needs to be some broader thinking about this space. Organisations who want to mobilise and be in this area in an emergency probably need some support to be able to do that. And we've got our peak body, Disability Advocacy Network Australia, who I've got to declare that I'm on their board as well, so there's an conflict there. But they're actually doing some work in talking to government right now about contingency funds and saying this is what organisations, who want to be in this space, because I know through Mary, who's the CEO, who's very well connected, she said that no other organisations in disability advocacy undertook any of the relief centre work. And I reckon that is just simply because we're so inadequately funded. They probably would have been thinking, how are we going to do this? But, if we live into our mission and vision and our values, we just felt we needed to be there. And essentially, it was our everyday work. It was our everyday disability advocacy work, but it was just in a relief centre, advocating for people who required it, required the supports. What was really interesting in another couple of instances was you needed to go to the government department at the relief centre or the government worker there and get a relief grant. They literally had the funds for people impacted. Well, we had many people who had a disability who had difficult experiences with DHS previously in maybe a child protection setting or something like that. So they didn't want to go to DHS, even if it was about a bushfire thing, but we were able to navigate that and say, hey, we'll be part of that conversation with you and we'll be part of that. And this is not about your children. It's not about anyone, any of the barriers. This is about you getting money, but we will be part of that and and we will be your voice at that moment in time. And there was at least 8 or 9 in those situations who they were just reluctant. And if they had to rely on going to the government themselves at that moment, they wouldn't have done it. So it's just the power of advocacy. We've done some wonderful work with Valid and University of Sydney since, and we're continuing to wanting to be in this space. There are some really good questions about, what's going on. What I'd say at the moment is it's really a pilot in Gippsland, and we're hoping that we could branch this out. I know of at least 30 other people in Gippsland who would be interested in PCEP if we could do this. And I also know there are other areas across the state through our relationships and networks that if we could go to them, they would certainly be willing to be part of PCEP. So it's about continuing to advocate and doing what we do on a daily basis. There are some really good, we call them vignettes, of the work that was undertaken. And that if you want me to put them in the chat or send them to you and David, there's some stories of people who have disabilities but were impacted by the bushfires, and some really powerful stories. One lady literally went to a relief centre in Bensdale after being given a runaround, and it wasn't accessible for her, and she was shunted away, and we were able to work with her as that was occurring and get her a really good outcome. So, yeah, happy to talk more about this. I could honestly talk about it for ages, so I better stop, Annette, hey?
It's all good listening to Adrian. Thank you. I thank Cameron and Maureen and yourself as well. We have a little bit of time for questions. If anybody wants to ask Michelle or the panel any questions, please feel free to. And we need some spotters because I have more than one screen to be looking at. All right, we have Grace.
So I was just wondering, how often would you suggest that someone review their emergency plan? Would you say that they should put it in their calendar to do it every 6 months, or is it just something you should do as it comes up? I'm from a support coordination background, so I'm really interested from that perspective in should I be sitting down with my participants and saying this is something you should do?
That's a great question, Grace. I do think it varies for different people, but I think a 3 to 6 monthly review and checking about it is probably a very helpful thing to do. We have in the PCEP workbook, and which you can download or go to Adrian's garage. She's got thousands of them. In the PCEP workbook, we have a nice little thing in step 2 at the very beginning. There's a bit of a number line. I don't know if you can see it well on the screen, but it's a bit of a quiz. How prepared are you for emergencies? And you could actually use that as a bit of a check-in with how prepared are you now, and also self or client feedback on how are you progressing in your preparedness over time. So there's some nice little tips and tricks throughout the workbook that help to make that check-in, I suppose, a little less daunting too.
Wendy has a question. Wendy? Okay, who else has a question? Okay, that's it. Okay, well then I might hand it
I know
over.
we've got a
Karen.
question. We've got
We
a
have a
question,
question.
Annette, from Karen Swift.
Thank you. Karen.
Hi, my question or comment was to Michelle, and I was part of the QDN cohort, and we've never met, but it was just so lovely to hear you say such complimentary things about QDN, and you know, that really makes my heart sing, because it's an organisation I've had a long history with, and part of the foundational people that helped to set QDN up. But I just wanted to add a comment to what you said. One thing that I found really helpful in the PCEP work, and it's something I've never really said before because I come from the social model of disability rather than like the medical model. But what I felt was particularly helpful was to connect in a peer group of people with similar disability to me, in that together we were just able to think of all kinds of things that I wouldn't have thought of on my own. Because, you know, there were 3 of us in my group, and the other 2 were men, and it was just amazing to get their insights into things that you would need to think about. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if that opportunity didn't exist. And it was sort of like the first time I've seen the benefit of like connecting around disability type. So that was just an interesting learning for me.
Yeah, it's a really interesting comment, Karen, because there's one thing that we've been thinking a lot and talking with our groups in Gippsland, but also in QDN and New South Wales about. Some people feel the benefit of getting together with people who have similar functional support needs so that they can have a better brainstorm together about it. And I think that is part of what I was talking about the tailoring to the individual needs of people, so that, you know, like peer groups might break off into smaller groups who have similar functional needs and a better brainstorm about it. The other group that we've been really thinking about is people who have intellectual disability. And at Queensland, the Hot Topics group intentionally came together to be supported and to really brainstorm around what are the support needs of people with intellectual disability in emergencies. And to help work that through at a pace that was more manageable for that group, and to do that over a period of time and with some participation support. So we're actually looking at ways now to expand that work and to expand some of the tools so that the resources are even more and more accessible over time. So breaking the workbook down a bit more, making more easy read versions, creating some more games and strategies around the toolkit itself. I think so that will be really exciting. And I think from my perspective, every time we try this stuff out with people who need to use it and use it to make their plan, we learn more about better ways to develop the toolkit for everyone. So it's really helpful. And thank you for that feedback, Karen.
Elaine has a question.
Yeah, we've got a question from Nadia and Carleen.
Yeah.
Do you want to go first?
You go first, Nadia, if you like.
Oh, sure. I just wanted to ask.
Hello, Mark.
I had to step out for a second, but
Good, buddy. How are you, old fella? I shouldn't call you old fella, should I? That's
Mark.
Can we mute there, somebody?
Mark Remnant needs to mute. Some Mark needs to mute. Yep.
Right.
I just wanted to ask if we'd got to those couple of questions and comments in the chat yet, because a few of those were quite good.
Right. So there was one there from Kevin Boyce, I think, and Kevin was just asking a question around people with cognitive and communication challenges who don't actually have support staff that are really all that good at caring and supporting? How do people like that get supported and linked into this kind of work?
It's such a good question, Kevin, and it's definitely something that came up in the QDN group, and I'm sure lots of people who are online who participated in those groups can add to what I'll share. But I'll tell a bit of a story by way of answering that question. One of the members of one of the peer support groups came together, and we were debriefing about the challenges they were still thinking about with regards to their plan. And so one of the members said, you know, for me, I get really jumbled in my speech if I'm stressed. So I know already that I'm going to have a hard time telling people that I need help or that my daughter's going to need some help. And I'm most worried about how I'm going to be able to communicate when I'm feeling stressed and in an emergency situation. And I think when he brought that topic to the group, the power of peers was really evident, because the peers themselves began to share really good strategies that he could use in that instance. A number of suggestions were made, and in the spirit of QDN's peer support, nobody forced any solution on the individual who raised the concern, but they all raised a number of possibilities. And at the end of that discussion, he said, oh, I really like the strategy that I could have a card in my wallet that had the contact of someone that if I was too stressed to talk, that would be the person. It says right on the card, please call this person. They'll help me to communicate with you. And that was the one strategy he felt he might take away and actually put into place, even though there were a number of other strategies that were raised among the group. Yeah, so it's really important. I think, Kevin, that raises the issue of the pre-planning. And another thing that I think is in your question, which is that person themselves making their own plan, actually then going to their support network to say, here's my plan. Did you know this is what I'm going to need? What's going to be available through your organization? So having the individual start to tell their service providers, hey, do you guys have a plan for emergencies? Hey, how are you going to ensure service continuity in times of disaster? How are you going to make sure that we're all safe and that we're managing support needs? So I think that the strongest voice in helping our service providers to make plans comes from individuals themselves starting to make those plans too.
Kayleen, you have a question.
Thank you for a really cool presentation. Two questions I have for you. When you're working with people who have the intellectual disability, how do you work for? How do you go? Having the conversation with the house staff.
Sorry, can you just repeat that last bit, Carleen? I just had to turn my volume up just a bit there. Can you just repeat that last bit?
I'm really keen to know how you work with the staff in the housing, so that they knew about the emergency plans, given that the staff turnover can be quite high.
That's actually a really important point. So I think what you're talking about is how, if we share our plans with service providers and service providers have lots of turnover among the staff, how can we be really assured that they know what our plans are? Bang on. I think that is one of the biggest risks in the system of having our plans. And part of the reason we also really want people to own their own plans and to be really aware of that. Also, when and where they can, with their informal support networks, with their neighbors, with people in their community that they trust. And part of the PSEP process is actually thinking about people outside of your formal paid support services that you could rely on in that instance. Because I think you point out a really important thing. There could be risks if you think, oh, I've communicated my plan with my support providers, so I'm all good. They've got me covered. I think we always have to go, how are we going to manage that plan? And we do that check-in ourselves. Yeah,
I
thanks
think
for
that's such an important point, sorry, because the person you communicate the first plan to is probably a 9-to-5 worker who might not be working on a weekend when an emergency would occur, quite possibly.
It's so big. And it's the same issue if we think that emergency services are going to save us in a disaster. It's another risk, right? Because emergency services, like we saw during Black Summer, were pretty busy. And they're not going to be able to come and get each and every one of us. So a big part of this process is that planning. So we're really feeling in control of our plans. And also so that we know what the gaps are well ahead, and we can work with emergency services and council and our formal support providers to help address those gaps. A big part of the research that I'm doing now is about the service provider role in this space. And it's very complex, but maybe in another year, I'll have some answers for you and we could have this conversation about the service providers too. I think there was another question from Carlene as well. Is that right?
There's another couple of questions. We have time for just a couple of quickies. Brooke, you're next.
Then Francesca, I think.
Yep.
Thank you, Annette.
You're welcome.
And Michelle, I have a question for you. I have been at your place before, because I did lots of volunteer work there at your place. I'm just wondering, I just want to know, do you do any more volunteer work there or any more office work there?
I'm not sure which place you're referring to. Is that
the one in Geelong?
No.
Michelle comes from Sydney. She works for Sydney University, so probably a different person, I think, Brooke.
Oh, sorry.
I wonder if I look just like someone in Geelong.
Sorry.
Francesca?
Sorry about that.
No worries.
Oh, thanks. I'm from Melbourne, so I've been suffering pretty bad with all these guns and stuff, and I thought bringing up over because it's a real emergency, and about all the changes and the when you used to meet as a group, you could have the cues on who was gonna want to speak or whatever. I find Zoom really difficult. Internet problems, whatever it could be. What Michelle was saying earlier about speech, I think that comes into the mix. And when you don't, I was doing just so much self-advocacy volunteering, and when all of that's gone, like you said earlier about purpose, it's kind of you get lost a bit. So I just hope would they mind, like, if this thing and make it a bit more inclusive and accessible to join all these things that are happening. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Francesca. There's a couple of things you've made me think about. And one is, I didn't speak a lot about it today, but our peer leaders talked about moving their support groups online as well, and how in some ways that helped to make things more inclusive, because for some people it meant they didn't have to travel, so it made it easier to attend. But for other people, it made it harder because they're not communicating easily through an online environment. For other people, they're not reading the social cues as easily through the screen as they might in a face-to-face environment. And for people who run culturally and linguistically diverse groups, it was really hard for them through interpretation in a Zoom environment. So I think it is really important that you've made me think a lot about the findings around shifting to the online environment and how that's not always possible. One of the things the peer leaders seemed to do to overcome that problem was they got on the phone. So the old-fashioned phone call and checking in with people was really helpful as a way of supporting on a one-to-one kind of basis. Yeah, and the other thing that you've made me think about is that importance of purpose. The Queenslanders with Disability Network, because they're the holder of, what will be done with all this information that comes from the community to the peer support groups into this group of peer leaders and then up to QDN. And I think that is really powerful, this importance of communication and the channels of that communication so that QDN can do the important work they do. Policy advocacy, filtering up the biggest problems and making sure they're addressed at the level of government. And that's really the critical, and the peer leaders really knowing that I'm part of this bigger purpose. But the fact is, even the people at the local community level who aren't meeting directly, at these policy meetings, they know they're part of the bigger purpose too. So I think that's that effectiveness of communicating that purpose and that meaning and that bigger vision for why we're here together. And I think that actually comes back to the issue of resourcing. So I think it's been an incredibly strong strategy that QDN has put into place that other disability organizations and advocacy organizations could really lean on as a way of securing funding for supports and resources. So it's a very powerful voice when you can get that many people feeding into what are the key issues coming from communities.
Definitely, yes.
Yeah. We have one last question for you from Mark, please.
Yeah, a lot of support agencies around where I live, which is a big regional town. If you live 30 kilometres out of the city, out of the town, they won't come out to a fire or a flood or anything like that. You sign the paper that a support worker will not come and the support worker will leave the property and leave the client. That's the conditions you sign.
I'm so glad you raised that, Mark. Did you want to add another comment to that? You just made me boil, I suppose.
Yeah, well, that's the conditions that you sign. So that's why I have contractors, I guess.
I'm really glad that you raised it. And it's interesting, the very recent research we did also on the Queensland project, but in another work stream, it was all about what's the capacity of service providers in this space. And I can say for sure that service providers are not included in emergency planning knowledge or information. We had the problem of people with disability being excluded from these conversations, and we've been addressing that. But we now have this double problem of their service providers also aren't part of those conversations. They're also not part of legislation. So they're not required to make sure that you have a person-centered plan, and that's connected to their organizational plan, and that's connected to their community, and that's connected, and so on. And that is something we are trying to change and develop. So maybe this is a good opportunity for me to flag that I've written an issues paper that was funded by the Disability Advocacy Resource Unit and VCOS in Victoria. And I hope that they'll be releasing it soon, but just so that everyone is aware that I've reviewed in depth what these issues are from the multiple perspectives And I made some very targeted recommendations about what needs to happen to support the service sector and what needs to happen at the levels above the service providers, because I'm sure you guys can all well imagine that your service providers come from all different levels of training and organizations, and it's quite a complex network to actually get up to speed around their own emergency preparedness plan. So I think it kind of comes back to what I said earlier. I feel like our best starting point is for each individual to take ownership and have their plan. And one of the videos on our website is of Rebecca, and Rebecca says, I started my plan and then I called a meeting of my 5 different providers. And I shared my plan with my providers and we had that conversation. So Rebecca's owning that process rather than thinking the providers own the process.
Well, thank you. And I'd like you all to join with me in thanking our speakers, Michelle, Maureen, Cameron and Adrian today. Solid, thank you. It's been a real pleasure to hear from you all. I'm going to hand back over to David now to do the next part of our forum. And thank you for me. I'm going to duck out and have my shot.
Thanks. That's managing another emergency, yes. The current COVID one.
It's not whiskey, I hope, Annette. You meant a vaccination.
That's the one.
So,
all right, see you all.
Thanks, Annette. Thanks, Michelle, for that really valuable insight into a particular issue that's been a major issue in recent times and likely to be so in the future. And also, you know, the power of peer leadership in that work, which is, I suppose, the focus of our session today. We've got a little bit less time than we originally had for this, but that's okay because you guys had some really good questions that drew out some important issues. I'd just like to talk a little bit about, you know, the purpose of coming together, and that we don't want to just run forums like this without connecting them or using them to connect us to deeper conversations about some of the things that have been raised today, some of the things we probably can't cover all that well that were in the chat, but that are really useful questions. And I think one of them that was raised was, you know, by a number of people is that tension between the peer support work that goes on amongst people within a particular diagnostic group or with very similar interests versus how do groups come together across the lived experience of disability to be inclusive in their own engagement with the mainstream of community. And I think that's a really good topic for maybe a future conversation, because it's one of the things that we feel has sort of perhaps divided and conquered the collaborative potential of this work of bringing people together. So in bringing you together today, we're sort of conscious of the fact that not only do we want to do good work together, but build, you know, that sort of collaborative spirit. And I think there are some lovely slides in the work that Michelle presented that encourages us to think about the power of collaboration and sharing knowledge and sharing expertise and making sure we spread our resources in the most effective way and use them in the most effective way we can. So this is part of the purpose of coming together. Some of you might be aware, if you're not, please get onto it, but there is currently a review of the information linkages and capacity building program, or at least part of it. You know, the part that is used to fund local area coordination isn't being reviewed, unfortunately, but there is a review of the funded program that supports a lot of the peer work around Australia. And it's a good chance for you to get in and do that survey and put your comments in. And if you haven't got that, it's probably a link we can put out. I think we'll put a little survey out to people after this who attended and who registered, so that we can get some feedback on things we could do differently in the future, because I think there'd be, you know, some really good comments we'll miss if we try and do that in the last 10 minutes. But I think it's really important to realise that not only is peer-led work important, I think emergency management is just an example of one issue that governments have come to local grassroots community groups led by people with disabilities for some answers, some solutions and some co-design. And I think this is going to have to be a feature of these groups into the future around a whole range of issues. So the importance of having local place-based groups in communities across the whole nation, I think is going to be crucial. From the experience we've had, certainly in doing that in Victoria, is crucial to enabling the legislation, the UN Convention, and all the other programs and policies to actually become effective. It's actually people on the ground making things work, showing leadership and stepping out beyond and above the role of paid professionals. We've heard a fair bit of criticism here about a system that relies totally on people who are paid to care. But what's highlighted today is some really good examples of people stepping up as citizens, taking action and acting fearlessly and outside boundaries and beyond the norm to make sure people are kept safe and things are solved and issues are dealt with. So I suppose we're very keen to foster a spirit of community collaboration, of peer-led work, and bring together organisations and leaders around this work to share stories and contribute to the development, the design of these forums. But we're also hoping beyond this to create some kind of collective or network of groups and leaders that want to work together. So we'll be sending out an invitation to people who are interested in joining in and doing this kind of work together. We'll also be encouraging people to nominate to be part of a working group to create a collective. To date, I suppose this work has been put up and supported by the community development team at Valid, but we want this to be not a Valid program, but a program for peer leadership across the sector. We're keen to see some kind of association or network evolve, particularly in Victoria, but maybe more widely, as things we have an abundance of interstate people with us today, particularly from Queensland. But to talk about how we go about building those networks in each state and territory and how we bring them together in some sort of conferencing and sharing and strategies for sharing ideas. So we'll be certainly sending that out. I think that the best way we can do that is to send out an invite with the survey and a few other things. And so if you want to get back to us, if you've got any other comments you'd like to make about today's forum or any of the future forums and some of the topics, there was one there that Kevin suggested around how do we use the social model to bring people together across their very diagnostic boundaries. And, you know, we need to create, I think, safe places for people to have some of those challenging conversations. I'm just not sure if there are any other final questions that people like to ask before we go, but I think I just wanted to share that proposal that we will be inviting people to join a network. We'll see, you know, it'll be shaped by the people who join as to whether it's just state-based or whether it goes wider, but we wanted to be particularly focused on a space that supports local place-based peer-led work. We think that if we've got that kind of platform happening across every local area, across, you know, Victoria and maybe even nationally, that issues like inclusive emergency management, you know, inclusive health services, inclusive transport systems, a whole range of things can be worked through at a local level by these groups if there is funding and resourcing on the ground in a long-term and sustainable way that really helps put legislation into practice. Any final comments or questions that people like to make before we bring our session today to a close?
David, Michelle's got some stuff in the chat that she might want to just mention. Michelle there.
Yeah, sure. I just clarifying that we have a DIDRR Australia Facebook page, Disability Inclusive Disaster Risk Reduction Australia. So DIDRR. I just wanted to let you know that we also have a Collaborating for Inclusion Facebook page, which can be confusing because there's two Facebook pages. It's actually the DIDRR Australia Facebook page that's most active because most of my work right now is concentrated on disability and disaster. But the Collaborating for Inclusion Facebook page is also active. You'll find more broad information there about inclusion. And quite often, if you want to get involved in research, a lot of my students will be posting information about their research. And you might find things that are interesting there, like inclusion at school, inclusion in the workforce, and that sort of thing. And I've put in the chat the website again, where you'll actually find the videos and the information is on a website called collaborating4inclusion.org. But if you have trouble finding it, just get in contact with anyone at Valid or anyone at Gippsland Disability Advocacy or anyone at QDN, and we can make sure you're headed in the right direction to get the information.
David, sorry, one other thing. A lot of people have asked about the recording. What's the two Davids there? What's the usual time frame for this sort of stuff to get, or Mal, to get up on our website?
I think if David there, he can probably tell us, because David's done an excellent job of doing a little bit of editing and taking out a few of the rough spots and making sure that it's something that's a little bit shorter and maybe a bit more accessible. But if David can tell us the timeline, and we'll make sure that people get the link somewhere on the Valid website at this stage.
Yeah, I'd imagine in the next week or so, within a week,
Yeah.
we get that up on the Valid website. Yeah.
Good. So we'll send out a survey just for comments and questions about today, and a request for any ideas about how we could develop this network further, and an invitation for people to register their interest in being part of a network, and also being part of a working group to do some of the administrative and organising work to put it together and make sure that it's a shared and jointly owned network that belongs to all of us, not just something instigated by one organisation.
Hey, David.
Yes, Brooke.
I'm going to ask you a question. I went onto that website, for the Val website, and it said it came up volunteers sign up. What does that mean?
We can talk about that later, Brooke. I'll let you know.
Because I don't know what that means.
No, just where volunteers sign up for the organisation.
Oh, that's right. Thank you.
Sorry,
Good.
David, one more thing, David. The forum on the 1st of December.
Right. So we've had many conversations in our peer action groups, and Valid's involved in running local groups in 8 different locations, 4 in the metro area and 4 in rural areas that have strong leadership from people with disabilities, and also are engaging with people, preferably or ideally some of the people that I think Kevin Boyce was referring to, that get left behind and are sometimes stuck in the segregated world of day centres. We've become conscious that the NDIS probably hasn't liberated people to life in the community in the way in which it was intended to, and that many people are still caught in fairly structured, institutionalised day programs on a daily basis or through their week. So we're just looking to see how we confront that barrier that's come about despite an NDIS that offers people some choice and control in their lives, and how do we engage and break out people from that world. We did talk about let my people free or go, but we don't want to be too confronting to the service providers. We want them to engage with us around that. What are we suggesting the title, Paul? I forgot what we said we were going to call it.
It's the pieces in the jigsaw. The pieces in the jigsaw. It's based on the idea of, collaborating for inclusion type stuff.
So it is about how do we make sure people that rely on support day to day to help them with communicating, with participating, with mobility, how do they get involved in it, and how do we make sure that peer support isn't just for people that have achieved a level of independence and self-determination? How do we make sure that we don't leave people behind in the change work that we're doing in communities, and how do we bring support providers back into that space, seeing how important life in the community is in a very serious way, not just sort of community tourism or room hire in a community centre. So that's International Day event. It'll be happening December the 1st, and it'll be an opportunity for us to try and run a longer day forum around the kinds of barriers and raising awareness around those barriers with service providers, with self-advocates and peer leaders, to see how we can begin to address that, and to work with some of the more positive support providers that have found ways of supporting people to engage in their communities more effectively.
We could call it the power of peers partnering, Michelle. We could just have a whole theme with them. Anyway.
So
we've got a title for it, so yeah.
So this, I'm just trying to see if in the chat is there any other things? I
think so.
So there's some good support there for the idea of linking together and doing this. So we'll certainly be doing that. I know there's a few people have contacted me about getting together and sharing some ideas. That'll have to be fairly soon, I think, around the ILC review and the survey that's being run by Swinburne University. So they will be conducting some interviews with people, but there is an online survey. But we thought it might be useful for us to even just share some of the ideas that we'd like to reinforce to make sure that the more times they hear them, there was certainly the the challenge around independent assessment system that the government was looking to introduce, but I think there's been an acknowledgement that, you know, the failure to really properly address tier 2 community work and peer-led work is an area that's been neglected, and there's no plan beyond June 2022 for most of the groups funded. So I think it's really important that we start to come together. So we'll certainly put out an invite to people that have attended today if we're going to have that conversation. Peter Persons has certainly expressed interest from Brain Injury Matters, and there may be others too that would like to, you know, come together around sharing some ideas to feed back into that survey. If there's no other questions or comments, I'd just like to thank everyone who came along today and made it successful. It was just great to have such a diversity of people. And I know we had a bit of a catch up with the Queensland Disability Network, some of the people from there earlier this week, I think it was, or was it last week? But anyway, earlier this week. And we're looking forward to having some get-togethers between our peer leaders to share ideas on how that work happens, and invite any other organisations that are interested in even just having some of those exchange of current programs and ideas. I'll leave it there, and thank you all for coming, and thanks for all your questions and comments, and hopefully we'll hear from you and get some feedback in the survey, and hopefully move towards forming a little working group to start to make things happen like this.